Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features or ideas, and how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
So, compañeros, welcome to episode 97. I hope you are well. If you are new to the show, welcome. If you've been listening for a while, thanks again for tuning in. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about SQL Server replication, and a topic that I'm sure is all near and dear to everyone's heart.
Yes.
And at first, I was a little bit nervous about the topic, but we've got a great guest, and I think the interview goes swimmingly well.
Yes, I know you're not the only one who's a little bit nervous about the topic. I know that replication makes quite a few people nervous. Yes. But I think with our guest today, Chuck Lathrope, that we will be able to, maybe get rid of some of that nervousness as we go through and find out a little bit more about SQL replication.
No, that's right. And I think, it takes me back as we've been talking, we talk a lot with folks that aren't familiar with databases. And it takes us back to that time, which I'm sure we all had. And if not, maybe you just got a little more bravado than most of us, where you're like, just don't touch it, right? Or it will break. And I think I still feel a little bit that way with replication. And yeah, Chuck has got a great handle on it. It's nice to talk with somebody who has kind of been in the trenches and been working with it for some time. And so we got a great conversation here lined up.
Yep. And Chuck is a principal data architect at Limeade down in the Bellevue area.
Yes.
And so one of the West Coast guests, as we mentioned, or as we talk about in the interview. That's a little bit.
Even for a West Coaster, He does a pretty good job. Okay, we do have a couple of shout outs we want to get to, and we'll just go ahead and say we apologize, right? So all we get to see is the name and text. We have no verbal, right? There's no audio here when we see some of these. So we'll just go ahead and apologize for we pronounce your names up front.
So the first one was from Julian Schrenk. And again, Julian, if I'm saying that wrong, sorry, but we did apologize up front. Hi, I listen to your podcast almost every episode and have learned a huge amount for my daily work in database development. Thanks a lot for your community service, Julian.
Yes, so thanks, Julian, for listening. Our next shout out is a slightly different take. And so Koos van Strijn, and again, you'll forgive me on the name, had an interesting take where he had listened to episode 72, which we had Lynn on, and we were talking about test automation in the data warehouse. And so he actually took some of that and was impressed, came up with some points, and then kind of responded to it and put it out on his website. And so he thought that was an interesting concept, or just a way to engage, kind of being able to give your own responses to some of the things we talk about. So, Kos, we do appreciate that feedback.
And on to the Compañero Conference.
That's right. So for those of you, I'm sure many of you have it on your calendar. For October 4th and 5th, we'll be down in Norfolk, Virginia for the Compañero Conference. The first price increase is going to come on June 16th. So just keep that in mind. If you're price sensitive there and you want to get your ticket in before then, June 16th is going to be the increase. We are going to have several speakers, and Kevin Fiesel, who has been on the show several times, is going to be one of those guests, and he wants to talk a little bit about what he's going to be doing at the conference.
My name is Kevin Fiesel. I am a data platform MVP. I'm also a manager of a predictive analytics team in Durham, North Carolina. I'm extremely pleased to be able to speak at CompañeroCon, even though I can't pronounce it. I'm going to be speaking on a couple of topics. One of them is security, and really getting an understanding of that network security, getting an understanding of what a database administrator can do to help secure a SQL Server instance. I'm also really looking forward to talking about a big data solution.
those are interesting topics to me. I know that we've talked a little bit with him about that on the podcast before. And so it'll be nice, particularly if those are topics that you have questions about, you'll have a full 2 days with him and to be able to dive in as deep as you'd like to.
Yep. And I think that big data presentation for the lone DBA, or you're the only DBA in the shop and someone's asking you to jump into big data, I think that is going to be a very interesting presentation, because I know there's a lot of people out there getting hit with that exact same question.
Sure.
What are we going to do with big
That's
data?
right. And I imagine that the conversation is going to ebb a little bit into the how is big data going to affect what I'm doing, particularly with some of the announcements that Microsoft has made here as of late. The relational model is not the only model available to us now. And so I think more and more of us are going to have to support different environments. And so it'll be interesting to get Kevin's take on some of that as well.
Yep. I'm definitely looking forward to the conference and hope to see some of our listeners there.
That's right. It'll be a good time. Okay, now for a little SQL Server in the news.
Oh, here's an interesting one. There's a new tool that Microsoft has released called the MS SQL Scripter.
Okay.
And this tool enables developers, DBAs, and sysadmins to generate, create, and insert T-SQL scripts for database objects in SQL Server, Azure SQL, and Azure SQL Data Warehouse from the command line.
Wow.
So rather than going into SSMS and right-clicking and script database and going through that whole process, it's a command line tool.
So I'll be able to generate scripts from all of these different features and kind of get that same T-SQL syntax that I'm used to.
Yes. And what I think is really interesting about this is it gives you a way to extract everything out of the database and get it into source control much easier than going through and clicking on the screens.
Oh, exactly.
And I know, and that's a process I've used to get things in source control in the past when I didn't have other source control options available. And I know it seems to always fall behind because you forget to go through the UI and do that. But if you could just script command line to just dump it all out and then diff or compare what's in source control to what you've got scripted out there, that would make life much, much easier.
Right. No question. And I think as well as more and more people, having just said that the relational model is not the only model, being able to use SQL Server and get involved with T-SQL, I know for me in the beginning, even from time to time, I still find myself generating scripts from SQL Server Management Studio for certain things. And this is a great way to kind of understand what's going on with, in those scripts and be able to learn that and understand it better. And so it'll be nice to have it from different options.
Yes. Looking forward to trying that one out.
And Rohan is the general manager for the database systems group at Microsoft. So he's kind of the guy over SQL Server at large. And he mentioned that SQL Server 2017 on Linux surpasses 1 million Docker pulls as the preview version rolls out. So wow. I'm not sure what numbers they're looking at, but obviously 1 million was a metric that he was very interested in.
Yes, that's interesting because a lot of people have speculated that, I know that SQL Server on Linux is interesting, but who's really going to use it? And the fact that 1 million have downloaded it and taken a look at it just through Docker, that's pretty darn cool.
That's right. So I guess if you were on the fence there, as you mentioned, of who's going to be paying attention, there's a metric you can hang your hat on.
Yep.
Okay, so the URLs for today's episode will be at SQLDataPartners.com/replication.
Or at SQLDataPartners.com/97 for the episode number.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and get into the conversation with Chuck. Chuck, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, guys. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. I know we kind of been talking about this for a few weeks, trying to get together. Happy to have you here as a guest.
Yeah, no, glad to be here, guys.
Even if you are a West Coaster, you're still accepted here.
Oh, great.
Hey now, Carlos. There's more West Coasters on the show than there are East Coasters right now.
Oh, man.
Yeah, we're winning.
Yeah.
Well, what I lack in numbers, I make up for in, ego, I guess, apparently.
All right. So today's topic is on SQL Server replication. And I know this is a topic that I first heard you talk about at SQL Saturday in 2012. And I found your presentation there really interesting. And I didn't pick it up very, very soon after that. But then when it came around to a time that I needed to use replication, I leaned back to some of those things that I learned from you back then. So it's great to have you on the show to be able to talk about replication today.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I've loved talking about SQL Server replication at SQL Saturday events. I try to do it as often as I can, just because I have all the battle wounds from having a very large environment with transactional replication. So whenever I can, I like to talk about it to waylay some fears and give out some best practice knowledge.
Well, that's interesting because I think there is a lot of fear around replication. You know, we brought it up in episode 56. Nobody wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And here you said you have a large environment with replication. Mm-hmm. I know I am interested to kind of get in here and talk about some of your experience and why maybe we have so much fear around it.
I think the difficult part about replication is that it does a great job of keep retrying even though there's a failure. So if you're not monitoring it correctly, it can go sideways, and if you're not monitoring appropriately, then it can get all kinds of bad, and then you get to stuck situations like, oh, now I've got this gigantic log file or distribution database. You know, how do I fix it? And then you go on the net and Google stuff, and there's so much bad advice out there that would basically destroy your entire environment, and you'll basically get a lot of wounds from trying to follow some of the advice out there. It seems to me like most of the advice out there is for people doing it in like a dev environment, not a real production environment. So there's not a lot of great. So I usually stick to like people like Hillary Cotter, I think.
Okay.
I have to look that up. Anyways, there's some great people out there that do from the Microsoft side and from consulting side that give great recommendation for replication. Stick to people who know what they're doing rather than the random posts on the internet.
Yep.
Let's tee up some of the components around replication, and let's talk about some of the moving pieces.
Yeah. So there's 3 types of replication. There's actually 4, but one's being deprecated, the updated subscription. So there's transactional replication, which is always running, always sending out data to your subscribers. And then there is merge replication, which allows you to do bidirectional updates. And then there's peer-to-peer replication, and then there's snapshot replication. And snapshot really is you do it on a less frequent basis than all the time, like transactional. So like in a data warehousing scenario, I could do like every 6 hours or every 12 or 24 hours and get that over to my data warehousing side of things. And that's what snapshot does. And my expertise happens to be in transactional replication.
Okay. So then what are some of the business cases or real use cases around transactional replication then?
Yeah. So the real ultimate goal of replication is to offload work from your main source of truth database server. So you can have multiple databases, and they can all be part of different publications that then send out to your subscribers, which are your clients that receive that data. So the main goal there is just to offload work off of that main production server. And that's this kind of goal in life.
So occasionally in high availability or disaster recovery conversations, somebody will bring up replication as a possible solution. Mm-hmm. And I've never had a real good feeling about that. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Well, just like you guys were talking about in episode 59 and the high availability solution, replication really wasn't designed to be a high availability solution. It was really designed to replicate some data, to get it off to other servers so they can do processing of that same data for whatever purpose you may need it for. Because what you can do with replication is publish out the tables, or if you have enterprise, you can publish out a view, and you can even publish out your store procedures and functions and whatnot, and your indexes. But you don't have the security that kind of goes along with that. And then and there's no automatic failover or anything like that. So your best options there is stick with always on availability groups or log shipping or database mirroring to do that high availability.
Okay. So if I really want to just move some data off to another server for reporting purposes, that's where transactional replication or snapshot replication might be a good solution.
Yes.
but not for the HADR at all.
Right. And the nice thing about the replication is it's available on all editions and versions of SQL Server. So I can have, standard edition SQL out there and use that. I can even use that on my distributor server. So to kind of give the bigger picture of that transactional replication, you have the publication server, and that's your main source of truth data. And then you have the distribution server that holds the distribution database that then sends that information to the subscribers. So there's always this three-way kind of path. It goes from the publisher to the distributor to the subscriber, and you can have many subscribers. And then you have one distribution server that could actually be on the publisher or the subscriber side. You don't have to have a dedicated one. But when you start getting to bigger environments, you definitely want a dedicated distribution server.
Okay. Now, I know you said it works with all of the latest or versions of SQL Server. When was replication first introduced?
Oh, it's been forever.
Wasn't
I think it even came back in Sybase days. It's been around forever because it's basically just pulling data from your log files, looking to see which of those transactions are flagged as marked for replication, and then sends that on down the path. So it's, been around for ages.
So with the replication going from a publisher to the distributor and then I said that backwards. No, that's right. Going from the publisher to the distributor to the subscriber.
Mm-hmm.
Does the subscriber have to be on the same version of SQL Server as the publisher?
No, it doesn't. You can have a mix. What you typically have is your distributor just needs to be at the level of your publisher. And so you could have, 2008 R2 publisher and a 2014 distributor and a 2016 subscriber. So your distributor just needs to be at the level equivalent to your publication. So you can have higher level on your subscriber. You can't just go lower on your distribution server than your publication server.
It's interesting.
Go ahead, Carlos.
I was going to. So we're talking about some of these, these terms, right? Publisher, subscriber, distributor. What the original documentation, at least that I saw, right, mentions kind of this newspaper hierarchy, right, which some of our millennials may not even know what that is. And so I feel like, and one of the things that was brought up is just, again, some of the overhead in maintaining some of this. Where has some of the love been? Because it's been around so long, where has some of the love from Microsoft been with replication?
Yeah, good question. So the latest kind of feature set just with replication is the support for always-on availability groups, such that if your main active server, primary, so your primary server can move to any of the other secondary servers, and replication will go along with it. So that's kind of the main recent support. And also that same team also does change data capture and change tracking. So some of those, those features have been receiving a lot of love in the past few editions of SQL Server. But, SQL replication's been around for such a long period of time. There's not a lot more features they can add on there that I could really think of, other than maybe helping out with supportability of replication. So most of the love is gone that route.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, and I think that's where I would have to agree, is that in the setup, like you mentioned, like all kind of the bad advice from, fixing or troubleshooting, I guess I would like to see a little bit more love there, because I feel like a lot of the fixes is, we'll just start it over again. So being able to tap into that a little bit easier and feel better about what's going on would be super helpful.
Yeah, it would, especially for people just getting into it. It could be overwhelming to do. I mean, a few books been so passionate about in the past. I has helped author a chapter of a book in the Tribal SQL book from Redgate, just on replication and kind of, here it is, here's how you kind of monitor it, and here's some best practices for it, just to kind of get more information out there, because there's been relatively few books out there. I can give a link to that. And then also Sebastian in Maine, which I think you guys had on a recent podcast. He created a fundamentals of SQL Server replication that's a free download from Redgate's books too. That's a great starting point, kind of getting into replication.
Now, on the front of troubleshooting replication, now, don't you have some scripts that you built that are available maybe on GitHub that can help with that? I know I've used them a couple of times. I just forget exactly where they were.
Yeah. So my SQL guy, Chuck, on GitHub has some replication monitoring scripts that I've used. And the kind of what I've lessons learned is in replication, they give you the ability to create what are called tracer tokens. And it's basically you insert this tracer command into your log file, and it's basically stuck at the very end, and it watches it go through the entire process to your subscribers. You can see that latency that's involved in there. And you can do that with the replication monitor tool, which is a GUI tool that you'd use to kind of monitor and maintain replication. But the trouble with the tracer token is that it's not really, if you've got a busy environment that's kind of overwhelmed currently, that tracer token might take, eons of time to get through, and it's you manually do it, or you can automatically script it. I mean, the Microsoft IT guys actually have up on one of the free sites for, I think, Script Center, where you can monitor replication. They've automatically created this tool that would continuously insert tracer tokens, and you could see kind of health with it. But I found that a little bit limiting. So my trick to tracking replication is look at the distribution database and figure out how many commands are waiting to be distributed out to the subscribers. And then I monitor that on a frequent basis, like every 15 minutes or every half an hour, and it sends me an email when it's kind of gone above some sort of threshold. And that threshold is a variable amount that I can put in as a parameter. Because in some environments, 5,000 records behind it is a big deal. Or in other environments, it could be hundreds of thousands of records behind if you have a really gigantic installation. So that's what my monitoring kind of does, is just monitor that queue that's basically up there in the distributor. And then I also monitor for kind of pain points that replication has.
I apologize. Before you get into that, I want to stop one and make sure that everybody knows. So all the scripts and things we talk about today will be available at SQLDataPartners.com/replication. So we'll make sure to put all those things up there. But you had talked about a tracer token. I guess I'm all of a sudden thinking, I'm thinking of a tracer. That's not profiler. All of a sudden there was something that came to mind that was like that. But so this is new to me, right? So It almost sounds like this is an object and I'm going to create in SQL Server that's going to start capturing commands, right? Which again, kind of sounds like, profiler or extended events. Is this just something that's specific to replication? I guess help me define what the tracer token is.
Yeah, it's very specific to replication. And it's basically you're sticking in this special little command. You can use T-SQL to create this little tracer token, or you can use the replication monitor tool to insert that tracer token and just watch it in the GUI. And it just shows you your time from your publication to distributor and then the time from the distributor to subscriber. And it's basically just goes through that path. You don't see it. It just happens kind of behind the scenes. It's kind of a little hidden thing that happens. But you can programmatically watch that information and see the results of it.
Okay, so I don't need to create it or modify it. It's already there. It's just what I'm using to collect the information from, right?
Yeah, you have to basically interject it. It's like putting like a die into a stream. You put this little die, a little drop in, and you just do like one at a time. So you manually have to put that die drop in the stream, and you watch that die drop go through the entire path to the ocean, I guess.
But in this example, that die drop, as you refer to it, is really a record being injected into the transaction log.
Yep.
And then when it's complete, that means that it's been through the part that catches the transaction log and moves it to the distributor and then actually ends up on the subscriber side.
Yeah.
So gotcha.
Conceptually, it would be almost like if you had a table and you just inserted a row to it and then you knew on the other side that row actually arrived. But it's
because that's the one you're looking at.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, some people even use what are called canary tables. So they'll just create a generic table and they'll update the date on it. So it'll just be a table of one column and it's just the current date. And so they'll replicate that out and use it kind of like a canary table so they can look at their subscriber and see how basically latent they are, because it should be as close to the current date as possible. That's another method you could use for monitoring.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that one.
So I know with the tracer tokens, in my experience using the replication monitor to go through and inject tracer tokens on a few dozen different publishers, it can be painful clicking through all the screens. And it sounds like you can do the same thing with T-SQL to just inject the tracer token. And that's, to me, that's one that I wasn't aware of. And it seems like that could really speed up the process of troubleshooting what's working and what's not working with your replication.
Yeah, I mean, the scripts that I have are pretty useful. I don't go down typically to the subscriber level, though. So I have, the typical monitoring of jobs and failures. The standard best practices that all DBAs do for all production databases. You need to do that for all the components in the replication, including your distribution database and your subscribers. So just the best practices of knowing when jobs fail, because all the replication jobs are basically kicked off with SQL agent jobs. And so you need to monitor for failures of those and be watching that.
Yep. So you mentioned these jobs as SQL agent jobs, and it seems like there's several of these jobs that are created when you initialize replication. Mm-hmm. What are all the jobs that are created and what specifically do they do?
Yeah. So there's the log reader agent job that's basically sitting on your master database that you're doing the publication on. It's reading the log file. Then there's the distribution agent. It's sitting in either one of two locations, at your subscriber or at your distributor. And the reason you have that is there's a push and a pull scenario when you get the data to the subscriber. And when you do a push, all the work is happening on your distributor server. And when you're doing a pull, it's done on the subscriber side. So if you have a really gigantic environment and you have this dedicated distribution server, you want to even offload some of the work off of it. So you actually have what's called the pull subscriptions. And you think of it as, I'm the subscriber. I'm going to pull the data from the distribution server. So I'm expending all the work to figure out what I need, data that I need to grab, and I'll go to the distributor and grab that information. And the push scenario is usually in your smaller environments. And smaller, I mean like you've got 5 to 10 kind of subscribers. And so in that scenario, the distributor is doing all the work and pushing the data down to subscribers. So those are kind of the performance tricks that you kind of switch from going from push to pull.
Right. Interesting. As we talk about these jobs, right, we kind of almost talk about, you mentioned reading it from the log, right? We know that the log is a sequential, right, operation, the way that it writes and things. Okay. And then you've talked about workload. Now, obviously, the answer is it depends, but from a percentage, a generalization perspective, is the reason that replication gets out of whack is because it just gets overloaded and just can't catch up?
That is one of the scenarios. And then, which if you're monitoring properly, it should be good. I mean, you could have not picked the proper server for your distribution server. Maybe it's kind of poor performer, or doesn't have enough RAM, or doesn't have enough CPU. Sure. Typically, it's the I/O problem of some kind. So you find out quickly that you have tons of transactions you're trying to replicate, and you're overwhelming your distribution server. Because in smaller environments, you can do it all set up on one server if you wanted to. It's not really, I don't know why you would ever want to do that, because the whole point is offload work off your publication server. But you could overwhelm any one of those.
So getting back in there, and I think you brought up or made a major point, at least in my mind, and that is the reason that you'd use replication and, again, the offloading component. I think a lot of times replication gets jumped to because you're trying to keep two systems in sync, right, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, some of these new features are maybe a little bit better at that, but you're potentially using replication for the wrong reason. And so replication gets installed on that main server, and so it just has to do even more work to keep up with all of that.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, that's totally true. I think people trying to use it because it's available in all editions. So it's like, oh, I can use standard edition and save a boatload of money because you really don't have any replication. I think database mirroring can do in standard edition with 2 nodes. I can't remember now, but I know in 2016, always on availability groups can do 2 node kind of cluster.
Right. You can't read from it, but it's available. Yeah.
So jumping back a minute to when we're talking about the different jobs on the publisher, distributor, and subscriber, one of the tips that I heard recently, and I haven't actually tried this myself, but it was a suggestion that for those jobs, it was suggested you go in and add a second job schedule to it, so that if something goes wrong and that job fails, there'd be a second schedule there that would restart it. Is that something that you've heard or is a common best practice?
No, I mean, replication will just retry. So in the distribution agent where you automatically retry when you hit a failure, like if you're like automatically scheduling like a snapshot and it fails, that could be a scenario where you might want to have these multiple things. But just like we said before, proper care and feeding of your SQL Server and monitoring those job failures. I mean, I could see it in maybe a snapshot scenario, but I wouldn't see it in the transactional replication because it will just continuously retry. So basically what it does is it retries and fails. A minute later, it'll retry again and fail. And it will do that forever until you do basically fix the problem. And usually the error messages it provides are pretty useful.
Okay, great.
Keeping in theme with that, again, the sky's the limit. But what are your, is there like a general rule or percentage wise, other than that process getting overloaded? Why does that stuff get out of sync?
Yeah. I think it's kind of these random hiccups that kind of happen. And, when you have these bigger environments, there's something happens, like common error that I see even in my environment is that the row doesn't exist at the subscriber. Like, well, why doesn't it exist? So why don't you just add it?
Right, exactly. Kind of like you're subscribing, you should get that row. That's part of the process, right?
Yeah. What the heck happened to that row?
Right.
And so then you have to spend time to figure out, because everything starts backing up once you have that one error. So you have to do tricks like you can skip that one row, or maybe you figure out what row it is. There's SP REPL commands. It can get you information about the transaction that was trying to apply to subscriber, and you can figure out what row it is and go manually add that row. There's also a command line tool called diff.exe, I think. But basically at the command line, a data diff, it can do a data diff between your subscriber and your publisher and tell you what rows are kind of missing and kind of screwed up and actually fix them for you.
Interesting. So you'd be okay, and I guess, to that point, so the row being missing at the subscriber is a common one that I've seen. Mm-hmm. You'd be okay with us just basically, scripting that out and inserting that row in there?
Yeah, just to make it go past that error. But I usually find it's usually like a group of commands that somehow didn't make it to the subscriber. And you could have the ability to, let's say, there's different agents that you can set up on basically all of these jobs. But the ones I typically modify up this in the short term, if I just wanted to skip errors because I know that, it's trying to update a row that it's got deleted for some reason because it doesn't exist in the publication, so it really got worked up. You can skip errors. And so you can set up this SQL agent to use this new agent. It's kind of like an agent profile is what it's called. So I could change this agent profile to say skip errors, and so skip a bunch of errors. But then you really want to use that data diff tool to figure out what rows are kind of out of sync, and you can just manually update the subscriber. And sometimes that really comes in as somebody on subscriber actually went in and deleted a row, But in reality is, I know that's typically not the case because I'll make that security read-only on the subscriber side. So it's like, there's no way it got deleted, but somehow it just, row went missing. So you got to do whatever you do to update the subscriber. And you have flights to do it. You can do whatever you want to subscriber side, and replication won't stop you. You can even make a setting and say, I don't want to delete any of the data. So when a delete happens in the publication, I can turn a setting on replication and say, don't delete this row, if you wanted to do that for your workload.
That's something that we talked about, I think, at SQL Saturday recently, was with that if the stored procedure was updating 1 million rows, now just to clarify to make sure I've got it right, if you didn't replicate the stored procedure call, it would send all 1 million of those updates across through replication. But you could just push that stored procedure call so it gets called on the other side, and then it's happening sort of independently on both sides rather than pushing it row by row.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so now help me kind of connect the dots there, right? Because in my mind, I'm thinking replication, that's by object, right? I go in and I replicate, this column with this table and whatnot. How do I set up, or, how do I visualize the process of saying, when this stored procedure gets executed, that's what I want you to take down instead of updates and deletes to this table?
Yeah. You basically configure replication and tell it that I want to use to replicate these calls to these stored procedures. And I honestly haven't used that use case because usually in my environment, it's like I can't just describe it as one transaction because it's related to maybe some other data that's within the system, or the data comes from something else. So I haven't been able to ever do that. But you basically just tell replication, I want to use to replicate these commands with some stored procedures, and you just tell it, and it will, if everything's right, it will use that stored procedure call and replicate that rather than all the individual changes that happen to your table.
Right. Well, I think that's a pain point for a lot of people. Going back to the whole subscriber thing and checking when the subscribers have issues, is that when they have, let's just say more than a couple, even then, let's just say you have 3, and that scenario you had, I still have to troubleshoot 1, so the source system, 2, my distributor, which you said it should also be another system, and then each of the 3 subscribers.
Yep.
So that's 5 servers that I have to go and kind of do something with, and I think that's maybe one of the pain points around replication. It doesn't give you a great way to centrally do all of that.
Right. Well, the replication monitor allows you to see all those 3 servers and help you with troubleshooting. I was in an environment where we had like 8 publications and I created 30 to 40 subscribers and a dedicated distributor. And we used to have replication monitor up on our knock window, and people would, look for errors and stuff happening there. But that was just unrealistic. And that's why I created those monitoring tools to look for those kind of errors or replication latency, where you've got tens of thousands of commands that haven't been pushed to the subscriber. And it's like, send me an alert. And then every 15 minutes, I see the trend. If the trend's going down, everything's good. If the trend's going up, something's wrong, because, that replication will continuously retry, even though there might have been a complete error. And if you don't monitor that well enough, you point of, it's been stale for 48 hours. How come? You don't want to be in that scenario.
Right.
So with the transactional replication on the subscriber side, if I'm using that as a reporting mechanism to offload some of the work from the publisher, if I need specific indexes on the subscriber to help with whatever the reporting is doing on that side, do I need to add those on the publisher and replicate them over, or can they just exist on the subscriber?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's one of the most powerful features of the replication is I can say either replicate the indexes that exist in the source publication or don't replicate them. And the great thing about not replicating them is your publication server has a specific workload and use case, and your subscriber is typically always different.
Right.
And what you can do is you can set up in the replication setup is what's called a post-replication script. And it's basically one file that can have any SQL code in there that will then create anything you want on the subscriber side. And it's run after the publication, when you initialize the publication. So initialization is just the method you go to publish all your data and get it to the subscriber.
Okay.
And so in that command there's actually two that you can do. You can do a pre and a post after you do this initialization. So what I typically do is that I come up and figure out my tuning on my subscriber side of what indexes I need, and I just add it to that script. And that script is, check, does it exist already? If not, add this index to this table. And that gets applied after your initialization has happened. So your table's been populated with BCP. It uses BCP behind the scenes, and then it creates indexes if you told it to. And if you told it to not do the indexes, then it'll basically go to your script. If you have one, you don't have to have one. And then you just add them. And I think that's the super kind of hidden benefit right there for replication.
Oh, yeah. It really seems like that could eliminate a lot of the replication bandwidth by not having to have those indexes in two places and synchronize over.
Yeah. It's not going to replicate over all your index changes. I think that's it's just whatever happens on the data tables themselves.
Right. But on the initialization of it, it's going to have to bring, if you're replicating the indexes, it's going to have to bring over the whole index, right?
No, it won't transfer that data. It replicates out the script.
Oh, okay.
Here's what the index is, and it will create that after the fact.
Okay. So then you would use this postscript only if you needed if the indexes were only needed on the subscriber side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Got it. Wow. A lot of great information here. This is good stuff.
Yeah, we only scratched the surface.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, no, that's right.
There's so much. It's crazy the amount that you have to get into, and this kind of carry on that earlier thought of having those 3 subscribers. So you typically would have those behind a load balancer, and then so I have this common name this is my order processing system, and so my application stack would just point to this one load balance name, and then it would get the information that it would need behind the load balancer. And then when I have maintenance, I can say load balancer, take this one server out, and then it allows me to create a new snapshot, and then I'll pause all 3 of them. So all 3 of them will become stale, but once I do a new snapshot, do a new initialization, everybody tries to grab it and pull it on, so you cause an outage if you don't pause the distribution agent. Then I work on that one server, get the snapshot applied, and then make sure the indexes are then applied, and then add it back to the load balancer, and I take my next server out, so it's up to date. And I may decide that I'm going to take all the servers and just use this one that's now up to date, or I may, have one stale and one up to date, and while I'm maintaining the other. And so that's kind of what in a bigger environment, what it looks like.
Yep. Okay, great. Well,
Very cool.
Shall we wrap it up with the SQL family questions?
Sure, sounds good.
So, Chuck, how did you first get started with SQL Server?
Yes. Well, I first got started with Microsoft Access. I started with Access 2.0 and back in 92, I think.
Gateway drug.
Yeah, it totally was. But I didn't really pursue databases as a career until the kind of .com crash in the early 2000s, when unemployment paid for my MCDBA certification classes. And so that I was completely scared of writing SQL when I was doing Access. I avoided it like the plague.
Sure.
And so once I took classes, this isn't so bad. So I did some consulting work on SQL 7 in 2000. Then I became a contractor at Microsoft supporting SharePoint for just a worldwide internal SharePoint farm, and worked with some guys, Joel Olson and Mike Watson, are kind of well-known players in that space. And they kind of looked to me as the go-to SQL guy. I'm like, holy crap, I've never done SQL clustering before and load balancing and stuff. I'd always, just done this MCDDBA course before. So I
Sure.
learned a ton there, and that kind of gave me the bug. So I became a developer after that. And then I had a boss who said that, no, you can't be the DBA because I don't really think you're got the skills to do that. So just keep doing your SQL development stuff. So I basically quit and found a new job doing a SQL developer and DBA.
Wow.
And I work, that's a hidden lesson out there for managers out there. It's pretty easy to piss off a developer when you say no, or an ambitious person, looking to learn new things. And my next
Tell them they
gig,
can't do it.
yeah. And my next gig, I worked for 7 years as a DBA and a DBA manager and supported just a gigantic replication farm.
So doing all the things your previous boss told you weren't qualified to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
DBA. And I even got picked for a top 5 finalist for the Redgate's DBA of the Year award. And so it's like, it's just the ultimate, response to, no, you can't do that. Oh, okay, sure, I can totally do this. It's not a problem. So now I'm a data architect. So I've kind of gotten the spectrum from developer on up to data architect, but I'm still a DBA as well because it's tough to find good DBAs.
It's really interesting how telling someone they can't do it will motivate them to just be wildly successful at doing it somewhere else.
Yeah, totally. And I'm probably really thankful he did that because I probably wouldn't have been where I am today. I love being a DBA. It's a great job.
Now, as great as SQL Server is, if there was one thing you could change about SQL Server, what would it be?
Only one.
Oh.
We're going to take your top one today. Maybe the next time you can, we'll dig deeper.
Yeah, right. I think that we need to get licensing more in tune with modern hardware specs.
Wow.
Yeah, SQL Express has 1 gigabyte of RAM and a 10 gigabyte database. I mean, you kidding me? You might as well just say, go to MySQL because we don't really care about you.
Yeah.
Yes, there's very few environments that SQL Express actually is a good thing to use.
It's useful for, right. I mean, you can use it even in the replication environment, which is kind of cool. But, I mean, my phone's got more power and capability than SQL Express does. And then Standard Edition is kind of the same way. I mean, you're limited to, 64 gigs of RAM? And, they say that you can use more with the heap space now with the later editions. But still, I mean, it's designed by untechnical marketing people and no rhyme or reason where these numbers come from.
Sure.
So if we wanted to limit it to one thing to change, I think we've got to fix that.
Yes.
Okay.
Model.
So what's the best piece of career advice that you've received?
Yeah. Well, I think that for me, it was just my boss saying that I can't be a DBA at our company. So I said, fine, I'll go be a DBA somewhere else.
Oh, nice.
Very good. Our last question for you today, Chuck. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
Yeah. I thought about this and I thought that, I wouldn't want some superhero strength or invulnerability. So I think that kind of the thing I would really like is just the power of wisdom, because I think that would just come in handy as a DBA and architect and reading the minds of developers of what in the world were you thinking?
Yes, and outside of the job, it would come in very handy in the rest of your life too. I know, and it would in my life.
Oh yeah, definitely, 100% there.
Yeah.
Well, Chuck, great stuff from you today. Thanks for being on the program.
Yeah, guys, thanks. I enjoyed it.
So, Steve, I guess my big takeaway here was that I don't always have to start from scratch when I have a replication issue. However, it still takes a bit of effort, I'll use that word, to narrow down, find the problem, and then resolve it. It may not be quite as easy as maybe some of the other features, but there's definitely enough feature set or there's access to be able to get in there once you understand it to kind of get back on the right foot should you go astray, or should the service go astray rather.
Yep, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that there's never going to be, I shouldn't say never, but there's not anything that we know of right now to make replication comfortable or easy.
Sure.
However, we can make it a little bit more comfortable or a little bit easier with some of the knowledge from Chuck, as well as some of the scripts he mentioned, some of the different tools out there.
Yeah. And I think knowledge is power as well, right? So getting those notifications and being on the ball about that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Because, it seems like it's kind of it can become a train wreck very, very quickly, right? Where it waits on that one record and then nothing else can go.
Yep. And I know in my experience, I've always been in a much better position when I've been able to be the one that says something went wrong with replication and here's what I've done to fix it, rather than somebody coming to me and saying, oh, replication, you fix it?
Right. Yeah. And that canary is that idea of having your own table with one row, one column, right? You update it, you replicate it, am I up to date? I think that's a pretty interesting idea.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that comparing that to how the tracer tokens work, I think that, yeah, there's some interesting things you could do there to, without having to use the tracer tokens.
That's right. Yeah, so at least I'm glad that we had the conversation with Chuck, although I have to admit that when I get into a jam, well, of course, you'll be my first call, but it'll be nice to know that my second call can now be Chuck.
Yes, indeed. Yep. And I know Chuck is someone that I've hit up with a number of questions over the years on what to do with replication, and he's definitely helped me out.
Okay, so our music for SQL Server in the News is by Mansardian, used under Creative Commons. If you want to hit us up, questions or comments, other topics that you think that we should talk about, you can leave those at sqldatapartners.com/podcast. And that will give you a form you can fill out. Let us know what you're thinking, or reach out to us via many of the different social media options available to you. If you want to reach out to us on Twitter, you can reach out to me. I'm at Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am on Twitter at SQLEMT. And we'll see you at the Compañero Conference.
SQL Data Partners.